Their message for humanity is that, and it's the tenet of many religions, is that we need to become more loving, we need to become forgiving of ourselves and forgiving of others, thus stopping the wheel of karma. We need to focus on becoming more service to others on a daily basis. And we need to focus on raising our vibration and our consciousness.
In the late 1800s, there were secret societies that were already working on advanced travel through space and time. They didn't have a lot of the science down yet, and they didn't have, well, the material science down yet either, but they were trying. And people, even back during this time, were reaching out with their minds to the cosmos, trying to connect with non-terrestrials. I think everyone's heard about in the 1800s the skyships that would fly looking a lot like dirigibles. And for the most part, they were dirigibles that were tweaked here and there to try to test different ideas and theories in space travel. In the early 1900s, there was actually the concepts of anti-gravity were actually already perfected. And little did they know that at least 5,000 years before that, humans had perfected it already. And we see that in a lot of the writings from ancient India. Dr. Victor Schauberger started studying anti-gravity vortexes in water. And I'm sure y'all have seen David present this information in the past, but it was fairly significant. It was one of the first times that someone outside of a secret society that didn't have access to ancient manuscripts had started to produce anti-gravity effects. There he is right there. And Victor, when he was doing his studies, he realized that the shape of an egg seemed to facilitate the torsion field a lot easier. You got lift when it was placed inside of a torsion field. And of course, he studied fish jumping, trying to go back up the stream to procreate. And he started to observe how some of the fish would move very little. They would get into a certain little zone and they would just be kind of sucked right up the stream. And he came up with all these drawings and to show the concept that he was observing. You can see the shape of the fish. It's not exactly the shape of an egg, but you still have that same oval shape that allowed the vortex in the water to pull it up. And he did the same thing with eggs inside cylinders with spinning water. And I don't know how that one got in there. I didn't know that was there. Eventually, when he was talking about his concepts, the Nazis overheard, and they decided they wanted to have a talk with him about what he had figured out. Well, they were so impressed, they went ahead and kidnapped him and made him a slave, which they were well known for doing. And very shortly after that, the Germans began to fly various types of disc craft using the Bell engine, the Glocke engine. There would be three for triangulation to to focus the gravitational waves. They did try to use conventional kinetic weapons on these craft, but it did not work out very well because when it would, after the report of the weapon, it would cause the craft to move around and become very unstable. They very shortly after the war, they started to learn how to use different types of directed energy weapons. And they started to use directed energy weapons on their craft, but as Michael Sola said before that, they were not armed craft. It's one of the concepts for the bell. Well, since the Nazis could go into space, they started to do so, and they found out very quickly that it can be a rough place. So they began to develop the alliances that they had made through the Vril Society and really started to make deals so they could go to the moon and set up a base, visit Mars, set up a base, without having any pushback from the people that were already there. They cut a deal with the Draco that allowed them to not only stay in large caverns in Antarctica, but also on the moon. And where they ended up setting up it was a base, it looked like a swastika, but it was not as big as they've shown on television and in movies. They were above ground. It was almost like shipping container size, and they were in the form of a swastika. Yeah, that's the nasty group they worked the closest with because they had the same polarity or alignment. Of course, this all began through a channeling group, the Vril Society. And I think they found the most unattractive women they could to be on the in the society. Yeah, that's an online dating ad for the Vril Society. Yeah. Just before the Conscious Live Expo, I had the artist Vashta, who's done a lot of art for Cosmic Disclosure. Well, first of all, how many, I think it'd be easier if you raised your hand if you've never seen Cosmic Disclosure. 3 people? Okay. 3 people. So Vashta put together these few pieces of art here to depict, and that should not be a black sun symbol behind her, it should be a Vril symbol. But this shows the technology of the Vril machines. They were extremely advanced. The Vril Society, they were not wanting to create this type of technology for war. They were looking to expand their knowledge and to bring spiritual knowledge to people as well. That's why they were more interested in the contacts they had with the Nordic groups. Once they had been in contact with the reptilians, they then started to contact people in associated societies, and then the Nazis found out about it very quickly, and they were brought in and questioned heavily. Okay, and something that I know is a bit controversial is back during the time that we were having all these visitations, I guess, men in black type people started to track the vessels that were visiting people and giving them knowledge. And one of them was, as Dr. Sala stated, a person named Sanjasi had been visiting people and imparting some very positive spiritual information to them. And it was far beyond where we were consciously. So it was coming from somewhere else. It was not information that someone had sat and, wrote a little manuscript and said, I want to create a new religion. And of course, they went, and people that were having these visitations, they would go and show them photographs. And there were a couple that were convinced that the picture of Maria Orsic was the person that they had met named Samjasi. The description is pretty uncanny. And the Nazis used Draco territory to build that first little base on the moon. And that base was a real struggle for them in the beginning because they lost people, they had crashes of their disk craft, and they had an even harder time on Mars. When they first arrived there, they didn't have the adequate shielding, and they had an older type electronics technology, and the dust blowing around on Mars created electrostatic discharges that was reaping havoc on their equipment. And what is that from Iron Sky? I think this image of it was nowhere near that size until after it was built out to be the LOC. Whoa. Well, in 1947, Operation High Jump was activated. And the Germans had been informed about some ruined cities, and also caverns that were under the ice and underground. And the Draco were living in the largest area, but they made a deal with the Germans to allow them to move their space program, their fledgling space program, and those in the leadership that they wanted to have escape the Allied forces. I think y'all are familiar with this one. That's the Anshar craft up the top. But this is very similar to what I saw when I flew under the ice, in between the ground and the ice. There were huge domed ice caverns, and the geothermic heat was coming up and melting the ice, and it was like a giant igloo. It was amazing. Now the Nazis could only get so far with their resources. They were very familiar with the American industrial might. We were producing 10 planes and tanks for every one they were during the war. So the industrial complex in the United States was coveted because they had big plans. The Draco and them wanted to expand our infrastructure in space, and the Draco ultimately wanted us to fight side by side with them against their enemies and also help them in conquest of other star systems. They first started making contact with our government through Project Paperclip scientists. A lot of the Project Paperclip scientists were still in contact with the Nazi factions in Antarctica. So they were trying to facilitate the first meetings, which the US government was not real excited about. And for 5 years, it really went nowhere. So the Nazis figured they would force our hand, because through the Project Paperclip scientists, they found out that the existence of non-terrestrials was the highest classified information in the land, way higher than anything having to do with nuclear weapons. So they saw that as a linchpin. They could fly around and show their vessels, or have information about non-terrestrials come out, or threaten to do that, which is what Iran did recently. If you remember, in January, they put out a big story saying Snowden has everything on aliens, that there are tall whites that are running the US government. And it was a matter of weeks later, we gave them $1.6 billion and pretty much agreed to everything that they wanted in the sanctions treaty. So there was a lot going on behind the scenes on that. In 1952, the flyover of the Capitol occurred. Everyone's familiar with that. This troubled the DoD, the Department of Defense, very much, because they were under strict orders to, no matter what, never reveal any information or the existence of non-terrestrials. And now they have, flying saucers flying over the Capitol. And if this was to happen today with all the iPhones, it would be over. We would have some sort of disclosure. David tells me that's an actual photo, but I haven't verified that myself. In 1952, Eisenhower began to have the meetings with about a half a dozen different groups, including the Blues. And these were very tall, blue, non-terrestrial that had some features like grays, but they were a totally different group. And the military-industrial complex guys called these people space hippies, because they came down and were preaching love and peace and get rid of your nuclear weapons. And a military power doesn't understand any of that. So they just blew them off. A little bit later that year, Eisenhower finally meets with the Nazi breakaway group, and an agreement is made to join forces in a loose way. And of course, the US planned to infiltrate and take over the space program that the Nazis had started. And as we see now, the opposite is what happened, because they were already dug in like a tick. The Nazis were. There was no way that we were going to. Yeah, it's a Texas colloquialism. And finally, in 1955, a treaty was signed with the breakaway German group, and from that point on, they really started to infiltrate and take over the different corporations. The Germans were seated in every aerospace corporation that there was. And of course, very soon after that, we have the founding of NASA. And then we had probably about 3 decades of brain drain of the best and brightest in all over the world were being recruited very quietly for these secret programs. And 25% came from the United States, with the remainder coming from the rest of the world. And they were heavily pulling people from Eastern Europe and South America. In South America, it was openly advertised. All in all, 55 to 60 million people were pulled into these programs. If half of those people lived through the process and then had children and their children had children, just imagine the number of people that are out there in space right now. And they openly advertised in South American countries, especially Brazil. The recruits were told that this was an extremely important operation, that it had to do with the continuity of species, that we had all of our eggs were in one basket. Here's another one for you. That if a meteor struck or some sort of cataclysm happened that was an extinction level event, that humanity would be wiped out. So their idea was to create a base on Mars and began to start trying to terraform Mars. But that ended up being kind of a cover story. It was they were deceived, and they ended up living a life of slavery. And then their children were tested to see how they would best serve the population, and then they were forced into different marriages at very young ages and forced into careers that they probably would not have chosen on their own. Around 1980, Solar Warden was formed. It wasn't completely autonomous and on its own yet, but they had most of the vessels developed, at least the concepts, and they were building them in a huge cavern down in Utah. And most of the engineering crew were living on the vessels as they were being built. So they knew how to, take apart the craft, put it back together, and were a part of the process. In 1980, a lot of people heard about President Reagan's briefing. It really happened, and President Reagan was briefed on non-terrestrials, I believe 4 or 5 at the time. He was told non-terrestrials that were interacting with humanity for thousands of years. And also he was informed about our Solar Warden, about our secret space program and its capabilities. And from what I understand, he was pretty blown away, and he was extremely excited and wanted to push the agenda even more than what they expected him to. And there were certain times when he got up and talked about, if the world were attacked, how quickly we would forget our differences and come together. He was living and breathing this stuff. It was at the top of his important list. During that time, strangely enough, nuclear armament and the Cold War increased instead of decreasing. And a lot of this was a cover story, because at a certain point, the Russians and the Americans were working together. And they were also both working together also to look for a way around this breakaway German situation. They were all being infiltrated and controlled by this group. So the Americans and the Russians were trying to figure out a way to mitigate how much power the Nazis had over both countries. Solar Warden in the mid-'80s really began to expand. They started building, they had one fleet in the beginning. They had one of the giant cigar carriers, and they wanted to have 8 battle groups. So once they built the first battle group, put it out into space, tested it, put it through its paces, they immediately put all their resources into duplicating as many as they could. This is one of the carriers, and if you look closely, you can see the torsion field. It's a left-right torsion field, spinning the opposite directions. And on one side, it's a smaller field to where it's almost like you squeeze a bar of soap and it shoots out one way. So when William Tompkins saw this image, he was taken back quite a bit, because it looked exactly like what he had been designing. In the torsion field that I had the artist add in there was what really blew him away. The German moon base that was shaped sort of like it was shaped like a small swastika, was then turned into what we know as the LOC today, the Lunar Operation Command. And it was after this point that they started learning how to build bases on Mars. The Germans in the beginning were finding ancient buildings and were pressurizing them and using them in the beginning. And then they started learning how to build bases out of local materials. That information was passed on later on to Solar Warden, and I took part in some of those. There were security outposts that were being built out of kind of like 6-foot long sandbags that were filled with the local earth and then stacked up on each other. And then they sprayed them with this stuff that's kind of like the truck bed lining. And then they sprayed them with other types of insulation and then pressurized them and let people inhabit them. On my Christmas break in 1986 is when I was taken and brought into the 20 and Back program. This is a depiction of the research vessel I was assigned to, much smaller than the cigar-shaped carriers. This was probably about maybe a 16th the size of the carriers. They're absolutely huge. Well, eventually, during this time that Solar Warden was developing and really starting to grow, the German group that had already formed ties with the Draco, they really started to develop their technology beyond what Solar Warden had with the help of the Draco. And they formed what became known as the Dark Fleet. And these were offensive forces. They were going out for conquest. They were going out if there was a problem in a certain star system, a rebellion and that needed to be put down. Dark Fleet would be sent, or they would fly alongside Draco ships and do battle. A joint Draco, and it's not really a joint Draco. There's a moon base that's shaped like a trapezoid, and this Dark Fleet controls the base, but there are also non-terrestrials that are on it quite often, working alongside. And Solar Warden could not find out what was going on inside of that base. It was almost impossible to get intelligence from. And it wasn't until later on when there was when the SSP Alliance formed and we started to have defectors from the Dark Fleet that we really started to find out what all was going on there. And it was very disturbing. That's a pretty close representation of what the base looks like. I saw it from further away than this. But it's a place where a lot of dark things go on. There was a former Air Force, a person that was in the Air Force, I can't remember her name right now, but okay, and she was taken to this place for days at a time, and she was worked like a slave, and all sorts of horrible things were done to her, and that gives you just a little taste of what goes on there. Very little was known about Dark Fleet. We knew they existed. We would see them around. They were just very arrogant, very elitist, felt like they, pretty much owned everything. But at the time, Solar Warden had no idea that they were working alongside the Draco and flying outside of our solar system to fight alongside the Draco. If we had known that, it would have been very difficult to make eye contact with them without some of the guys, starting a fight with them, because the Draco were not at all liked in Solar Warden. There's so much that is similar with the Dark Fleet and what you see on Star Wars. It cannot be coincidence. The way they dress, wearing all black, it's just uncanny. How they carry themselves, they look the same, kind of pale, gaunt, like they haven't had sun ever. Very vitamin D deficient. That's very close representation to the way they dress. And of course, their vessels, the wedge-shaped ones looked very much like the ones off Star Wars. Then we have the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate. It's the most powerful secret space program. They control the design and build out of all technology. So pretty much any of the corporations that you associate with the military industrial complex, they have had their CEOs or board members, once they get 20 years in and are trusted, they'll be approached and told, listen, why don't you retire, and then we'll put you on this super board. And on the super board, they would be working in interplanetary affairs and making decisions on who would get what technology would be hidden from what group. And of course, they keep all of the best toys for themselves. They're the most advanced group out there. Of course, they were kept a secret from Solar Warden in the beginning. It didn't take long, though, for us to figure out that there was another group out there when they were showing up at the LOC, when our group would come in to, for leave. These were cosmic capitalists. All they could see were dollar signs or a way to obtain more technology and biological materials from outside of our solar system. So they began to figure out ways to capitalize on what the non-terrestrials wanted from us, and also the different space programs, the technologies that they wanted. They would develop it just as far as they wanted that group to excel. They would hold them back by the amount of technology they would give them. And of course, they withheld all the best things for themselves. Very soon, they established bases on moons around some of the gas giants. Of course, a lot of the area on the moons around Saturn and Jupiter are territory of non-terrestrials. When we were doing studies around Jupiter, there was very little airspace around Jupiter that we were allowed to travel through because of non-terrestrial embassies. That's what we called them, as embassies. Well, they figured out very quickly that they wouldn't be able to keep this a secret if they have people mining ore and putting things together all over the place here on the planet. They had worked for years in compartmentalization, having people, putting a screw in here and then pass it on to the next, it'd be shipped to another location, and then they would put that part inside of another part, so no one got a full picture of what they were putting together. Well, they finally decided that the best idea was to build out infrastructure on Mars for mining and industrial complexes for fabricating the materials they mined into usable materials. Some of the manufacturing plants on Mars house 250,000 people, support them. So they have living quarters very nearby the manufacturing plants where these people live. And I can tell you that the conditions they live under are very Spartan, and they don't get to raise their hand and object to anything. I myself was pretty shocked when I was brought to the Mars facility and I got the dog and pony show from the ICC, and they showed sort of like slideshows like this, but of all these different technologies of craft, components that they produce and trade to over 900 civilizations that And these civilizations mostly stop by here when they're traveling further distances to pick up supplies or replacements for technology that they're having problems with. And we got the reputation very quickly of being very meticulous and sharp engineers, which, as Dr. Solis said, that's really hard for a lot of people to wrap their minds around when, we're still using, combustion engines from the late 1800s. Well, the touchy subject, the interstellar slave trade. This group saw that different non-terrestrials were taking people off the planet, so they saw a chance, they saw an opportunity. They saw us as a commodity. They figured, why don't we do a blockade, not allow the non-terrestrials to come in, and we ourselves will abduct people and then trade them to the non-terrestrials for technology and biological specimens. And the scale of this slave trade is so large that if we do get a full disclosure, that's going to be one of the most shocking things about this whole cover-up. We have the Global Galactic League of Nations. This was a carrot that was offered to all of the member nations of the UN. And it was proposed that they give all of these nations a part or a place in the secret space program as long as they guaranteed they would not let the cat out of the bag, that there were non-terrestrials and that we had advanced technologies that would collapse our economic system. In their mandate, for security reasons, they were to operate completely outside of our solar system. And before I was brought into the secret space program, when I was in the MyLab group, I was brought to one of their facilities. It was on a moon of a gas giant in another star system. They believe that they're working on the continuity of species and protecting us from a non-terrestrial invasion. So they believe very heavily in what they're doing. They're compartmentalized from other secret space programs. They know very little about other space programs, and other space programs knew very little of them, if anything. They wore uniforms that were, very much like Stargate Atlantis. They had their country patches on one shoulder and the project patches on another shoulder, and they were jumpsuits that were very similar. And I don't think that was a coincidence either. Of course, I visited the base that I just mentioned. I visited there a few times. Then we have the unacknowledged special access programs that are ran by the military and intelligence groups. And they have a lower spectrum of technology available to them. It is closer to our technology, our current technology. There are multiple programs. The Russian program falls under this as well. And they all vary in sophistication. And if they see another craft fly by that is unknown, they are told that it's a concept craft that is being developed and not to speak about it among themselves. So it's a real easy way, if they see a non-terrestrial craft or a craft from one of the other space programs, that's a real easy way to cover it up, even in the lower military programs. They're told that there are no ETs currently visiting humanity. And I've been surprised at how deeply they believe they're being told the truth. They're aware of the ancient builder race ruins. They've investigated some of them. And again, they were told that this is from millions of years ago and has very little bearing on what's going on today. And of course, they work within mostly the military-industrial complex, and they're unaware of any of these other secret space programs I'm telling you about. They will vehemently oppose you if you try to bring it up to them, because they believe they're at the top of the totem pole when it comes to intelligence, that if they have the need to know all of the cosmic disclosure information that you guys are getting. But they are certain that there are no space programs above them, there are no non-terrestrials visiting us now, and some of them do believe that we're being visited by time travelers from our future. That is what we're seeing in the skies. That's when I was abducted by one of these groups. That's what they were trying to push down my throat, was that I've been deceived that these different groups were us from the future. These groups fully expect to be a part of a disclosure narrative. They've been prepped, they've been told that the information about their program is going to be released in the near future, and that after that happens, that they are going to be kind of, like astronauts, how people worship the astronauts in the 60s. And they're looking very forward to this partial disclosure that they're a part of. And, to be honest, they've had a lot of casualties in their program, and they want some recognition. They believe that they're fighting the good fight, that they're a positive group. And they're going to be more surprised than we are if, in a full disclosure scenario. They're really going to be upset. No, it's not Solar Warden. It's the lower military and intelligence programs. Well, in the 80s, we started to have giant spheres coming into our solar system. In 1980, there was a giant, I think it was the size of Neptune, but it was a physical metallic craft that was just huge. And it came in and it started flying around the different planets, just like it was doing a joyride. And we hailed it and asked, what are you doing here? And they said they were just on a cruise, basically. And our secret space program pretty much ran them out, told them to get out or there was going to be conflict, and this group left. And the secret space program had no idea that there were craft this size out there. They were shocked by the size of the vessel. In the late 1990s, all of a sudden, all of these giant spheres started, and spheres that were tangible, metallic, and these energetic spheres that I've been talking about started to come in from the outside the solar system. And also, they started to come into our solar system through using the sun as a portal. And of course, the Cabal thought that it was a return of their Sumerian gods. And I heard in the Pentagon, there were admirals and generals that were talking about the return of the Sumerian gods. But if the spheres were not what they thought they were. When they moved into our solar system, they positioned themselves and then phased out. And our secret space program knew where they were, and we would approach them and try to hail them, but would get no answer whatsoever. They were completely ignored for a long period of time. And here are some SOHO images many of you are probably familiar with. Some of these are orbs that are streaking across, so they look like solid lines. Look at that. Yeah, it's the sun. That little disc in the front is what they use to block the sun so that it doesn't blind the instruments that are looking at the corona. And with every one of these, in every one of these cases, we've checked with the planetary software, tracking software, and there are no planetary bodies in this area. These are streaks. Look at that one. Yeah, no straight lines there. It's just... There's a close-up. Okay. I think I have the planetary tracking on this one. But as you see, these are planet-sized objects. These are not objects that are close to us and appear, because of the position of where SOHO is, they can't be small objects that are close to SOHO. And also the way the instruments work on SOHO with how it focuses in on, it only focuses in on objects that are further away. So the military industrial complex and the various space programs are sitting back watching this unfold. More and more spheres coming into the solar system, not announcing themselves as you're supposed to. As you come in, you give a friend or foe either signal or communication. And all of these craft were coming in and ignoring the status quo or the proper way of coming into the solar system, and were just cloaking. So the secret space programs, they were getting more and more concerned. Here we go. You can see the objects. We tracked where planetary bodies would be, and down where the one sun cruiser is, there's nothing on the software. Look at that. Yeah. Now, NASA says that these are two comets that are traveling equidistant from each other and just happen to crash into the sun at the same time, which is astronomically impossible. Yeah, not likely, if you ask me. "50 comets." So at this time, we already had quite a few spheres coming in. But in the 90s, the secret space program, they were in a observation mode. They knew that there was nothing they could do about it. They didn't know the intentions of the spheres coming in, but they were just trying to gather as much intel as they could. In 2012, when everyone expected some major event to occur, well, I guess it was occurring. We just didn't know about it. We didn't have the ability to see what was going on. But in 2012, hundreds of these spheres, the size of the Moon, Jupiter, and Neptune, started to come into our solar system. The groups that were observing this and that were concerned went into a panic. They now understood that these spheres were not here to help them in their agenda, but they didn't know why they were here. Yep. And I guess that brings us to the end of my first presentation. Thank you.
I have some questions. I was interested, of course, about some of the Semyasi information. You mentioned that the secret space program, or the Nazis originally had questioned the Vril girls. What came of that questioning, and what happened to them, and from your understanding, and how they didn't rein them in or control them, or what happened to them?
Well, they were very well connected with other societies. So the Nazis couldn't really just, pull them in by their hair and make them do what they wanted them to do. They had friends in high places. So
who, and in what kind of high places? I mean, were they Nazi assets, or they were already traveling in outer space?
They had connections to people that were high up in the Nazi Party and in other societies. They worked closely with them, so they had friends in high places. So it'd be very difficult for the SS to just grab them and throw them in an internment camp or something like that. Mm-hmm. They had too many friends.
So they questioned them and then released them, and what happened? Was the girls did they each have their own ship? Was this supported by Vril society groups that were traveling autonomously, separate from the Nazi party?
Yes, they were autonomous from the Nazi Party. They provided the Nazi Party with the information that was requested. They put them in contact with non-terrestrial groups. They provided them with copies of all their schematics of their ships, but they had very wealthy donors that helped them build out their program, and their program was non-military. It was to go out and explore, and they were very interested in the spiritual aspects of what was going on. They were not mm-hmm. looking, the answers they were looking for were more of a spiritual or esoteric nature.
Right.
So even though they were German during the time of World War II, when the Nazis were in control, they were very opposed to that way of thinking and that energy. They had to work with the Nazis a little bit, but as soon as they had their own craft built, their own space fleet, they were broken away. And they did have a small base down in the Antarctic area and in South America, but it was not associated with the Nazi group.
And they were left alone, the Dracos and the other groups that were working kind of counterproductively in Antarctica. They were they were a very small Earth-based civilization, or did they have protection from other higher spiritual forces? They
were working closely with some of the Nordic groups.
Okay. So positive Nordic groups.
Right. And they received a lot of spiritual information and teachings mm-hmm. from mm-hmm. these groups, and they were adamant about sharing it with humanity, but they they could not, under the confines of what the Nazis and Americans had agreed upon. If they were to appear as Earth humans and start imparting this knowledge openly, they would then be in conflict with these military-industrial groups.
So they had to pose that as extraterrestrials.
Correct.
Now, do we know, do they have bases in the Pleiades and things of that nature? Were they in contact with groups and had bases?
They were in contact with groups, but the bases they had were here, but they did travel outside of the